BRICS is a term representing the coalition of 5 regional economies, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Initially referred to as BRIC until South Africa's inclusion in 2010, this alliance is committed to enhancing the global economic landscape, reforming financial institutions, and addressing other global challenges. Since 2009, the member countries have convened annual summits, with each nation taking turns to host. This year, South Africa is set to host the BRICS Summit on June 2 and 3, 2023 in Cape Town. In addition to the existing 5 member countries, Russia announced its support for Algeria's bid to join BRICS on March 16, 2023. Furthermore, on April 25, 2023, it was revealed that 19 countries had expressed interest in joining BRICS, including Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, Senegal, Sudan, Tunisia, and Zimbabwe. With an increasing number of African nations showing interest, the overarching theme of the alliance revolves around BRICS and Africa, partnership for mutually accelerated growth, sustainable development, and inclusive multilateralism. The question arises, will an alliance with BRICS further Africa's interests? Well, joining us on today's One Slot is Adewale Ajadi, an African affairs analyst. He'll be joining us from Abuja in Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, looking at the issue of BRICS, I mean, we're seeing it as a very emerging economy. We're seeing countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, China, all in it. Now, since its inception in 2009, how would you say its growth has been, especially when it looks at the economy that the BRICS stands to portend for Africa?
Well, it's been it's the new way forward, it seems. For a long time, we've had U.S. hegemony control the world economics in different ways. Even when there were competitive forces like Japan, who had developed capacity, they were within the U.S. triad influence between the U.S. and the EU. And so the world has actually collapsed behind that hegemonic power and the power of the dollar to influence the direction of economics in general and monetary policy. The BRICS offer viability and option. They offer an alternative to a world in which we are all queuing behind the leader. It gives Africa the opportunity to grow in its capacity to influence the direction of the world. BRICS countries together are one of the largest trading partners of the continent. So I think it's a great direction that BRICS offers for the entire continent.
What do you think were some of the determining factors for this growth that we're seeing in the BRIC countries? What influenced this growth that we're seeing?
Well, you know, for most of the capitalist orientation, it's been Western orientation. For many of the countries, it's been that they have been curtailed in their ability to express their own economic potential, their own development potential. It's like the world has been living in a one-dimensional space. And, you know, that's not sustainable. And if you look at it, the kinds of interventions that we have seen across the geopolitical space of the world has meant that most countries that could have developed their own capacity, their own direction, their own alternatives have been curtailed. So essentially, this is a powerful opportunity. And you know, in the past, what it has meant for many countries is that whenever they try to flex this capacity, they're destroyed. I mean, without being alluding to conspiracy theory and all of that, you think about Libya, you think about any other country that's kind of flown the kite of being independent and being a maverick. So this is a direction that has been very beneficial to many countries who are involved, if I got your question right.
Okay, now, Adewale, I mean, the theme for this year, we're looking at BRICS in Africa, partnership for mutually accelerated growth. And we're in a staging area where we're looking at Africa being more dependent, you know, looking for economic growth for all African countries. How do you think, or what specific benefits can African countries expect from forming an alliance with BRICS at the upcoming summit?
Well, firstly, think about it from one point of view, from one very selfish and one-dimensional point of view. China is one of the greatest creditors to the African continent. Building a greater relationship with China, a more sustainable, a more viable, a more understanding relationship, is going to be powerful. The second thing is that just looking at each country, China offers a viable alternative to what the US has always created, which is a kind of inferiority complex and a kind of bullying tendency, because the US doesn't just give you support, but it insists that you borrow its cultural norms. China doesn't do that. So China is a big part of BRICS. Certainly India has become such a powerhouse in terms of its medium growth, in terms of pharmaceuticals and things that are relevant to Africa, like malaria vaccination, the COVID vaccination, all of this capacity to develop things that would sustain the development in the continent. South Africa is our brother and our sister, and we are engaged in some kind of detailed discussion under the AU. So there's so many things that you look at. But then let's look at the African Common Trade Zone. That's a powerful space in which to engage BRICS and to engage people like Brazil, who have established the capacity to develop medium-sized industrial capacity across their country, agricultural, industrial complex as well. These are all big things that will benefit Africa, free it from dependence on natural resources, and create space for the burgeoning amount of young people who are coming into the labor market and who need to be productive.
What do you think would be some of the bottlenecks that you're envisaging? I mean, if we're looking at this partnership, yes, there are a lot of benefits from it. If you look at the member countries, you talk about China, you talk about India. What are some bottlenecks that you envisage that might hamper this successful procedure or this benefits that we're potentially hoping to see with BRICS and Africa coming together?
Well, the most important bottleneck that you have to consider is to what extent we are not going to end up in competition with each other. We have a tendency to sometimes get into unwarranted competition, and some of the conflicts hangovers that we've had in the continent might play some part into it. But so long as we are very clear from the start of the potential benefits we want to get out of it, so long as we do this in alignment with the AU, think about it. BRICS is a very powerful way to stop queuing up at the United Nations looking for seats on the Security Council and begging for the expansion of the Security Council. There is also clear terms. The countries in the BRICS are the countries that have grown in the last few decades to become powerful. So there is a lot to learn there. So I don't envisage fundamental bottlenecks in that sense. But of course, what we have to now start to do is actually trading that avoids the cost of shipping and all of those things that have become a problematic, cargo and all of those things that have become problematic. So would BRICS support the growth of the African common market? Would BRICS be some way of engaging so that Africa goes within itself, intra-Africa trade, and not be about trading across the oceans and all of that? Those are the areas where there might be problems. Certainly, would BRICS be involved in helping us get over the kinds of mess that we are seeing in the Sudan, that we have seen in Mali, we have seen Burkina Faso, where there's been dictatorship, military dictatorship coming into power? Is there alternative ways to start to resolve our problems without resorting to conflict like was engaging in Ethiopia? And BRICS will be influential in that. Those are all the things that are going to be important. And in some way, BRICS has not been tested in that area fundamentally. And BRICS also has Russia in play, and Russia has chosen violence as a solution to its problem with Ukraine. So these are also things that we have to be mindful of. And India is not perfect in its own intervention, in its own domestic problems as well. I mean, there's a level of tribalism that emerges from the religious conflicts in India. So these are all things that we have to help each other grow out of. But we would have these options. It is important to have an option outside the hegemony of the United States and the West. And I think BRICS serves that purpose.
Now, still looking at these bottlenecks, oftentimes Africa's partnership with other international partners is often unequal, so to say. I mean, if you look at relationship with the United States, some people will perceive that, you know, these other greater European countries are gaining more from Africa, even though Africa deserves more. Now, with this potential BRICS alliance with Africa, how do we make it mutually beneficial to both these countries and Africa, and not in such a way that it's not, or we don't see an unequal partnership between the BRICS countries and South Africa or African countries?
That's a great question. And certainly one of the most important things is not to make it a relationship of raw materials. So things like oil don't become central to the relationship. Primary goods, raw material goods, because that's the colonial relationship that we developed not just with the Europeans, but we've developed with the United States. We need a relationship whereby we are working mutually on the longer term issues of developing the capacity of Africa, on secondary products that are developed in Africa being targets and markets internationally. So the relationship we have with China at this moment and India is still a relationship that is close to those colonial relationships. So what we have to do is actually be clear as Africans what we're getting ourselves into and what we want from these other more advanced, developed spaces. And that might mean organizing ways in which there is mutual research and there is investment in digital technology across the board, there are joint solutions creations. I mean, there's some things that China is doing that's beautiful, which is the investment in infrastructure. Those kinds of things can develop the capacity of African countries to compete. So we need to set those standards. On their side, we need to also engage with them very clearly on their own ability to pollute the world with their own advancement. To think seriously about environmental damage, to think seriously about creating solutions to these things, to think seriously about alternative energy interventions like solar energy and things like that. That would help immensely in developing our own capacity if we are producers of solar energy and all of that. I mean, for example, Nigeria is not in the BRICS, but the point we make about lithium export is a profound one. That we would not export lithium if we are not producing your cars in Nigeria. We're not going to be a ground for primary raw materials being exported. We've done enough of that. So those kinds of things will help immensely and will change the trajectory of the African continent. We are about to enter a phase whether BRICS takes us seriously across the board in the continent or not, that where we are going to be able to actually compete effectively because information and knowledge is diffused now. It's not exclusive to one part of the world as opposed to the other. So in a few decades' time, Africa would be competitive whether BRICS is online or not. So they might as well become the partner to Africa, moving from one phase of development to the other, and that would be great.
Now, I'm going to pick China, I mean, one of the BRICS countries, and you would agree that it's a very big growing economy, which you also talked about, and you also mentioned investment in infrastructure. Already, take an example from Nigeria. We're seeing a lot of growing relationship and investment from China with Nigeria, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of debt along the line also. I mean, what are your fears with this partnership, and how can countries like Nigeria make sure they're not indebted to these BRIC countries, for example, China?
I think there's a great misunderstanding of how debt works. Nigeria is not an indebted country. I think it's a gross misunderstanding of the situation. There are two dimensions to this. In terms of percentage of Nigerian debt to GDP, it's actually relatively small compared to most countries in the world. We're talking about less than 40%. In terms of revenue generation, that's where the problem is. Is Nigeria generating enough revenue to service its debts at the moment? And the issue is, are we paying taxes? The issue is, are we generating the resources for the government? I mean, we pay less than 8% of our GDP as taxes. So this is a significant issue that we can do a lot better about. But is that a problem? I'm quite sure it's not. I mean, it's not different from you having an overdraft facility and you starting your working life at a particular stage, and you can develop a lot more, but you're not where you need to be. So I don't think that's the worry. Where we are in the African continent is that we're sitting on a lot of potential drivers of great capacity. What it depends on is our own ability to motivate our people, to inspire us to be productive, to motivate our people to pay their fair share of taxes. It's not, and whether we are taking loans from China or not, we're going to actually need to invest and fuel the kinds of infrastructure and the kind of capacity that's going to industrialize and digitalize the continent. That's going to come from one source or the other. We have a lot of domestic debt, and compared to what we get from outside, it's a lot more domestic than externally. So I don't think the worry is indebtedness. If you look at most of the countries that we look at and think are doing exceptionally well, if you look at their debt burden, it's astronomical compared to what we are talking about in respect to ourselves. You are going to have to need the kinds of investment. If you are not getting foreign direct investment, which we are not getting enough of, then we are going to have to live with debt. It's a choice we have to make. So I don't think we should be worried as a developing nation about taking funds it's what we spend the money on. Are we spending the money on developing capacity? Are we spending it on paying salary? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
If we are investing in our own capacity to become a stronger and more capable economy, then debts are not a problem. And this is across the board. We're at that stage in the continent where we shouldn't be scared of investing in our capacity to compete. And that's what we should invest in. So the issue is not whether we're taking debt. The issue is that are we spending our money, the debts that we're taking, on our capacity to be competitive globally? And that's what we need to focus on.
And are we actually taking it? Are we being competitive with all this investment and loans? Because that's also, just like you said, that's the big issue we're having here. We're seeing issues of corruption in most African countries. So yes, you're taking loan, which is a good thing. But when these loans are given, are we actually investing it properly? Or is there proper production in Nigeria or all these African countries?
Well, it's a bit mixed. The jury is out on what we are doing. In fact, if you really look at it, you're going to need, let's take Nigeria, for example, you're going to need a few years of post this administration to look at the impact of what they've invested in. And it's down to all of us how we do that. Is there corruption? Of course there's corruption. I mean, I'm not saying that you ignore corruption. That's a law and order issue that has to be dealt with. Is there any country there's no corruption? It doesn't exist. So it's not a zero defect issue. It's something we have to continuously improve at. And if we allow ourselves to use corruption as the excuse for not investing in what we should invest in, that's a problem. But let me put it in a different way. The challenge we have is not the challenge of whether we have corruption or not. The challenge we have is, do the people participate in governance? Because if you participate in governance, if you're paying your taxes, then you want to know where your money is going to. But if you are not holding people to account because you think that, okay, they will steal, and when we get there, we can do our own and all of that, then you have a problem. Across the African continent, we have to make sure that young people, older people, all participate in governance, not just at elections, not just for voting, but across the board.
Okay, while you talk about taxes, I mean, on the other hand, people will talk about the overspending of governments. But let's switch to Russia now, which is also one of the BRICS countries there. What are the potential benefits for an alliance with Russia and Africa?
That is more problematic, I think. My reflection on Russia, the jury is still out on Russia in many ways, especially because of this situation in Ukraine. The Ukrainian situation has put into sharp relief what Russia is doing across the world and what its strategic interest is, especially because it also has a mercenary organization that seems to be intervening in the African continent and has had some very dubious results, whether it be in Sudan, in Mali, and other places. So it's difficult to say, but Russia is a very powerful country, has an immense potential to be a force for great change in the world. It's independent of American hegemony, and if it gets its position right, it would be quite influential in the direction that Africa goes, because it has the opportunity to show many African countries that is not a threat to them politically. We will see how that plays out. But certainly in the BRICS arrangement, Russia has to comply with other countries who are powerful. So I don't think Russia will be an exclusive determinant of the way things go. And we can see that Russia is willing to have Africa on its side. So that's a plus as well.
Finally, still looking at the growth of all of this, personally, rather, we just have 5 countries under the BRICS. That is, we have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. South Africa is the only African country among this BRICS grouping. And right now for the summit, we're looking at the expansion. Do you foresee more African countries joining the BRICS, or do you also foresee the BRICS accepting these African countries joining? Because we have series of countries. We also see Nigeria, we see Senegal, we also see Zimbabwe, all indicating interest to join the BRICS. So let's look at the acceptance and these African countries seeking interest in joining BRICS.
I'm sorry, can you please repeat that question? Where I seem to be having some problem with.
All right, so quickly, we're looking at the expansion of BRICS. Presently, there are just 5 countries in the grouping, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. South Africa is the only African country. So we're looking at, first of all, the acceptance of more countries into the BRICS, in more perspective, more African countries into the BRICS, and also the interest of other African countries in joining the BRICS. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I'm fairly sure what I understand you are saying is, should the other African economies join the BRICS, and how do you think their interests will be taken care of? Or
we're looking at, okay, Adewale, we're looking at the possibility. Did you hear me? We're looking at the possibility of these African countries joining the BRICS and the acceptance by the BRICS to the African countries.
Well, the opportunity for other African countries to join is one of the most powerful things that we'll see in the 21st century. BRICS can become the tool for Africa to be globally competitive, to move from a situation where we are subservient and playing colonial roles, colonially subservient role to France, to the UK, to the US, and all of that, towards a position whereby they are negotiating their interests. I think one of the things that we must bear in mind is how low intra-Africa trade is. The trade amongst African countries is very, very low, is extremely low compared to trade with even the BRICS countries and the colonial powers that used to rule Africa. So BRICS can be the platform that African countries use to make AFTA become a superstructure. Because then we're not talking about just trading amongst African countries. We're talking about trading with these larger countries who have larger economies, who have a potential to boost trade. And if you remember, one of the sticking points at the last EU-Africa negotiation was about EU dumping low-end electronic products and such like that in Africa, and then collecting raw materials from African countries. This can be negotiated out of the way with BRICS. So I think most certainly, by being the emerging economies, we would be, that's joining BRICS, we have the potential to do exceptionally well for ourselves. But the other side is also great. African countries joining BRICS would give BRICS the greatest possible influence you can imagine. Because certainly they would bolster their own capacity to speak across all platforms in the world, with huge numbers of viable emerging countries joining them and becoming co-players in a new kind of dispensation. Remember, part of the goals of BRICS, at least part of the policy, is de-dollarization.
Yeah.
We have a world where the dollar has become such a force for damage in the economies of countries across West Africa, countries across the African continent. So this is the opportunity we have as well, not just to change the conversation, to develop alternatives to the dollar and to create ways to trade that is not dependent on one country alone.
All right, thank you so much, Adewale. Lots of discussions there with the BRICS Alliance and Africa. We'll definitely see how the discussions will pan out as they're having their summit this June 2 and June 3rd. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you very much for inviting me.